Hello folks, this is Mike and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the basics of PowerShell Remoting or PowerShell Remoting 101. So I just realized a few days ago when I was putting out a video on how to configure remoting on a Windows 11 computer with PowerShell 7 that I had never really gone over some of the foundational stuff with PowerShell Remoting. So when I first started my channel, I had put together some foundational videos on using help, get member, working with object commandlets like select object, for each object, where object, stuff like that. But I never got into remoting itself, so I figured I would fix that here. So if some of you are experienced in remoting, this is basically covering the basics of that, so this video might not be for you. If you are a bit unsure of how PowerShell remoting works, what it does, what it doesn't do, stuff like that, this video might be right up your alley. So with that, let me flip over to my lab environment here. And I have a Windows 10 client. I believe this is the client I used for making graphical PowerShell scripts that I've done a few past videos on, and we'll do some more on that in the future. But in here, this is a computer that does not have remoting enabled on it, right? So the first thing to kind of talk about here is what actually constitutes PowerShell remoting. Okay, because there's lots of different ways for one computer to contact another over a network. Like for instance, if I bring up computer management here and I go point computer management at a different computer. So let's say I'll go point it at the other computer I have in my lab environment, DC1. And I am logged in with a user account called admin, who is a domain admin in my lab environment. So I click OK there, and it doesn't necessarily look like it's doing anything, but it actually did connect to DC1. So for instance, if I expand out services and apps, click on services, give it a moment here, and I should see the services not from my client computer here, not locally, but from DC1, which is a domain controller, a Windows server. All right, so give that a moment to chug on through here. And basically the point I want to make here is this tool is using some protocol over the network. In this case, it's using RPC, but it is using some protocol over the network to go fetch information. Okay, so this application is running locally and it's using a protocol to fetch data from a remote computer. So I could see here, for instance, the Active Directory Domain Services service. Active Directory Web Services, go down a little bit more here, I can see DNS Server, right? So these are all services that are running on DC1, not running on this local VM here, Client 2. So this tool is indeed fetching that information remotely. So it is fetching that data, right? Now let's use a PowerShell example here. So if I open up PowerShell and I use a commandlet, let's say get service, right? Maybe I'm looking for the bit service and I want to tell it to go contact a remote computer. So it'll go fetch that information, hopefully, and then bring it back to me here. But the point I want to make with this particular commandlet is running locally, and I'm telling it to grab information, and it's grabbing that from a remote computer. So it's using some protocol to be able to do that. Okay, now we don't necessarily know what protocol that is. So it's up to whoever developed that commandlet to pick what protocol it uses to reach out to a particular remote computer. And there are a decent amount of commandlets that do have a computer name parameter on them. So if I use the get commandlet and I tell it show me all that have a parameter of computer name, I can see those listed out here. Okay, so you look at all of these and they all might each have their own way of contacting a remote computer using some type of protocol over the network. So they might be using RPC, they might be using WMI, they might be using the remote registry service, something. Okay. Now, all of these that contact a remote computer, they may not be doing PowerShell remoting. Right? So, in fact, there's very limited commandlets that actually use what we're going to talk about here, PowerShell remoting. So these ones that right here, like enter PS session, invoke command, and new PS session are going to probably be the main three you're going to use if you want to do PowerShell remoting. Right? So just because you have a commandlet that has a computer name parameter does not mean it's using PowerShell remoting to contact a remote computer. It's going to maybe use remoting, but it could also be using some other network management protocol like WMI or RPC or something like that. Right? So with this case, let's talk about what remoting really represents. So when I talk about PowerShell remoting, it's almost like the PowerShell equivalent of like remote desktop. So if I wanted to connect to the desktop of another computer, I could use remote desktop to do that, right? So I'm sitting on this computer. I could start up the remote desktop client, okay, and I could go tell it, hey, I'd like to remotely connect to the desktop of another computer. So I'm on client 2 and I want to connect to DC1. So I could go ahead and tell it that I want to do that. Right? Now, I don't know if this is going to work or not. I don't remember if I have remoting enabled on DC1. I don't think I do, but let's see. Okay, looks like I don't. So let's go fix that. So I'm not going to show it on the screen. I'm just going to pop over to the DC1 VM here. Actually, I will show it on the screen. All right, so here I am on DC1, and let me go in here and enable remoting. All right, so let's go to remote desktop. Oh, and we'll turn it on. Okay, so now I have it turned on. And so now we'll switch back to client 1 here, client 2, I'm sorry, and go try to connect that again. And notice I can put in my password. Okay, and now I am looking at the desktop of DC1. Okay, but I'm on client 2. Right? So what remote desktop is doing is it's allowing you to have an interactive desktop on another computer while sitting somewhere else, right? Right, so I could go ahead, take this, maybe do a sign out of the remote desktop session, and now I'm back on the CL2 desktop here. Okay, so that's remote desktop, right? And in order to do that, I had to enable it on the computer that I wanted to connect to, right? So in DC1, I had to enable it. Now, if you look at, let's say CL1 here, or CL2, I'm sorry, and I look at remote desktop, notice it's not enabled here, okay? So in order to turn it on, you need to have it on for the computer you're trying to connect to, not the computer you're trying to connect from. Okay? Now let's talk about PowerShell remoting. So with remoting, it's like remote desktop, except it is strictly a PowerShell session. So when you do PowerShell remoting, you're basically telling the computer to open a PowerShell session on a remote computer as you, or whatever identity you want to run it as, run code in it, and send the results of that code back to your local computer. Okay, so it's almost like, again, the PowerShell equivalent of like maybe Telnet or SSH or, again, remote desktop. Right? So you're opening a PowerShell session on a remote computer, running code in it, and then bringing the results of that back to your local computer. Okay? Now, in order to do this, you have to have it turned on. So for instance, if I go back over to DC1 and I try to I try to connect to it, and I apologize, the video just went on me here. Let me go ahead and reconnect to log in. All right, there's our desktop back again. All right, so now let's say I want to connect to client 2 via PowerShell Remoting. So I can open up PowerShell here, and maybe we'll try and do enter PS session, computer, client 2. So I go ahead and I try and do that. And this should crash and burn on me, okay? Because I don't have remoting enabled on client 2 unless somebody snuck into my VMs and turned it on and I wasn't aware of it. Okay? I guess maybe I don't know what the dog gets up to at night while I'm sleeping. Maybe he's using my VMs. So no, it looks like the dog stayed sleeping just like I thought here, and remoting is not enabled on client 2. And it is not by default. Okay, so in the Windows scheme of things, on client computers like Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 11, your client operating systems, PowerShell remoting is off by default. On your server operating system, starting with Windows Server 2012 and newer, so 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, 2019, 2022, so on the server operating systems, PowerShell remoting is enabled by default. Okay? So on client OSs, it's off. On server OSs, it's on. Okay? And so if I want to turn it on a client operating system, what do I need to do? So on that client operating system, you need to log in locally or log in through a remote desktop or something like that, and then open an admin enabled PowerShell session. And basically you could type in enable PS remoting. You could throw a force parameter at it if you wanted to. That'll suppress any like questions you get asked. If the computer is on a public IP address that's on the internet, you might have to tell it to skip the network profile check. Like by default, it does not enable remoting on a computer whose NIC is considered public. It's basically a security enhancement there. So if you want to force it, that's what you have to do. Now, I don't need to do either of these in this case. So I should just be able to do enable PS remoting and call it a day. All right, and as I say that, change the network connection type to either domain. Oh, okay. So maybe I do have to do that. Didn't think it was on a public connection, but let's see. All right. So now what that does is it adjusts a firewall rule for Windows Remote Management, or WinRM for short, and it adds in a listener. So that's basically listening for a connection coming in. Okay, so with PowerShell remoting, it does run on a specific protocol. The protocol is called WSMAN, WS-MAN, which stands for Web Services for Management. And that protocol, Microsoft's version of that is what they refer to as WinRM, Windows Remote Management. So again, the industry standard, WSMAN. WSMAN actually has ports on it, 5985. Okay, so 5985 is basically the unsecured version, the unsecured port, and 5986 is the secured version of the port. Okay, so one, you do not need certificates on either computer for it to work. And this one right here, you need certificates for it to work. So we use certificates to verify the authenticity of the remote computer. All right. Now, with both of these, all the data is encrypted in the packets going back and forth to WSMAN. So the difference here is 5985, we don't use certificates to verify the authenticity of the remote computer, and in 5986 we do, right? We do use certificates. Okay, so when you first enable remoting, it enables just this port right here. So in essence, it's like an HTTP connection, but it's not using HTTP. All right, so it's using WSMan on port 5985. If you want to further secure this, you could add a certificate to this computer and turn on listening on 5986. Okay, so more steps would be required for that. However, in a lot of Active Directory environments, most companies don't bother because the computers already verify each other through Kerberos authentication and Kerberos tickets, if you will. Okay, so even though we're using 5985, the authenticity of the remote computer is done through a Kerberos authentication session. Okay, so we have that benefit of Active Directory doing that for us. But if you did not have Active Directory, if you had non-Windows computers that you wanted to connect to, stuff like that, computers in a work group, computers in other Active Directory forests where there's no trust set up, maybe the listener with certificates might be the one you'd want to use. Okay? So that turns it on for an individual computer. If I want to turn PowerShell Remoting on for a lot of computers at the same time, I can use group policy to do it. So depending on what we wanted to do here, and I just realized I've been talking for God knows how long here, and I did not have the right desktop focused in my video here. So, all right. So I apologize for that. Let me go fix that. All right. So as I was saying, so if you follow the follow the audio, enable PS remoting was what I did on client 2 here, and you could do the skip network profile check as I had mentioned, and the force parameter you could also use as well. All right, and then you just heard my whole spiel on 5985 as the port for WinRM and for WSMan 5985 and 5986. All right, apologize for that. I realized I was looking at the wrong desktop in my recording screen here. All right, so we enabled PS remote. All right, so now I want to do this for a lot of computers, right? And so group policy could come in handy for that. So let me go back over to the domain controller this time. Remember to switch my desktops. And on there, if I open up, let's say, group policy. So I have the group policy editor over here. And in group policy, I'm just going to pick on the default domain policy, but realistically, you'd want to adjust this on a policy that affected the computers you wanted to enable remoting on. So I could go ahead and look at that, go into policies, admin templates, Windows components, go down to Windows Remote Management right here, find WinRM service, and notice this allow remote server management. Okay, so I know this is not just for servers here, it's basically turning on WinRM. So you can go enable it. And for listeners, you can configure the filters for what IP addresses you want to connect to. If you don't want to be particular here, you could just put wildcards in there for those, and then be able to hit OK. And that would enable remoting to a lot of computers through just a single GPO. All right, so if you don't want to walk around to each computer and do enable PS remoting, you could do that. Okay, so now that I'm over here as well, let me go try and connect back to client 2 again. So we're going to do enter PS session. Oh, before I do that, let me just type hostname here so you can see that I'm on DC1. And we're going to go enter PS session, client 2. I go ahead and I run that, and notice it connects me right over to client 2. All right, now with this, it is connecting me to a remote PowerShell session on client 2. So if I type in hostname, I can see that that command was sent over to client 2, executed in a PowerShell session on client 2, and the results were brought back over to here. All right, so I can see again that result. If I typed in ipconfig, again, that's running on that other computer, and the results are being brought back over here. All right. So then if I want to exit this, oh, before I exit it though, notice when I first connected, it didn't ask me for any credentials. It basically takes the credentials of who's logged into the local session. So if I do who am I, it sees that user, it sends my Kerberos account token over to that other computer, and if I have the permissions to get in, it just lets me in. It's like single sign-on, right? Just like if I were to try to connect to a map drive or connect to some other Windows resource on a computer joined to the domain. It just lets me in, all right? So with that, I can now exit and I'm back out. So if I go back to the host name, the session here is now focused on the local computer DC1, right? Okay, so that's one way that you can use remoting. You could do enter PS session and exit PS session, okay? But it is kind of like a one-off thing, right? It's not gonna connect to a lot of computers at the same time. So it's very similar to like if you're using Telnet or SSH or something like that. Now, one of the cool things about remoting though is the ability to use a command that could be pointed at more than one computer. So that commandlet is called invoke command. And with that, you can point it at a single computer, like let's say I do here, and then I can furnish it a script block where I want to tell it what commands I want to run on a remote computer. Like maybe I'll do get service name bits, something like that. So I go ahead and I run that. And that is, so this code is sent over to a remote computer, runs in a PowerShell session on that remote computer as me, and then the results are brought back locally for me to see in this console. So invoke command basically opens a remote PowerShell session on that computer, runs the code in a script block, and then brings the results back locally. Okay? Now, if you also have a completed script that you want to run instead, like what if I have a lot of stuff I want to run and I don't want to type it all out in a script block? Well, what you could do is, let's see, do I have a data folder here? Yes, I do. Let's say here, let's go, no, not a folder. Wanted. Hmm, this thing won't let me create a text file in this folder. That's nice. Okay, let's pick another folder here. How about temp? No, and you're not letting me do that either. Okay, so something's going on with my computer here. However, let's see here. Let's copy that, paste that, rename that. Just call it remote. Let's do an open. Okay, and let's say that's the only command in here. All right, so that was remote. So now, instead of doing a script block, I could do a file path, C colon temp remote.ps1. So I could put the script in there as well, and it'll take the code in that script, send it to the remote computer, execute, and bring the results back. Right? Now, one thing to note about that, I mentioned, it sends the results over there, brings the results back. If you pipe the results to get member, you will see that it puts them in a different namespace. They're coming back as deserialized. And what deserialized objects are, you basically get all of the properties that are originally on the object. So for instance, this commandlet that I was running, get service, that does produce a service controller. But notice there's no methods specific for a service controller. There's no start method, there's no stop method. So it strips off all the methods except for a couple PowerShell generic ones here, get type and toString, and then it just brings back all of the properties. So the result produced, the object produced in the pipeline is not the same as if you were running this command locally. Okay, so they are deserialized. All right, so now, so I run this, right, against a single computer. Could I run it against multiple computers? Absolutely, you could. So client 2, comma, DC1. Happens to be the only two computers in my lab environment, but anyway. So I could go ahead and do that, and I could see that this ran on two computers now. And so you could target this against however many computers you wanted to, right? If you had like a text file that had a bunch of computer names in it, you could do something like get content, I don't know, C colon names dot text, right? If you had a bunch of computer names in a text file, that could load those in and then run this script against those particular computers. Right? So invoke command has that ability to do that. Right? So that kind of makes it nice to use there. Now, if you're not doing that, you could have done Active Directory queries. Okay, so for instance, I could do get AD computer. Let's just do filter star, right? And then grab the computer names specifically, not the Active Directory computer object, but literally just the raw computer names out of the name property on those. So I could use for each object, member name, and then just grab the name property. Right? And that can go and grab computer names that way as well and return them as strings that could be sent to this particular parameter here. Right? So you have a lot of different ways of getting computer names to this commandlet. If you want to grab 1,000 computer names, if you want to grab 5 computer names, you have a lot of options available to you. So you could just list them all out like here, or use some code in a parenthetical expression to grab the computer names. Just to be aware though, whatever you do, it has to output the computer names as string objects because that's what this parameter takes. Okay, so that's why I did the for each object here. Normally get AD computer produces an AD computer object. And so I need the strings for that to be able to work. Right? Um, so again, you know, like get AD computer, filter star. Okay, that'll go grab all of the AD computer objects like in my demo environment here. And notice they're not strings. They're AD computer objects. So what I need to do is I need to grab the value out of one of the properties that's in string format. So typically when I'm doing this, I either grab DNS hostname or name. So again, the easiest way to do that for each object, apologize, for each object, and member name, I'll grab DNS hostname in this case. And notice what it does is it grabs the raw values out of the DNS hostname property and puts those into PowerShell's pipeline. And the objects that those were string objects. So I should have, if I take this and pipe it to get member, I should see that this is producing strings into the pipeline. Okay? And like I said earlier, if I look at the help on invoke command, computer name, where is it? Where is it? Yeah, computer name takes string objects. So again, that's one of the biggest ways that people mess up with PowerShell is you have one type of object in the pipeline and you're trying to send it to a commandlet or a parameter on a commandlet that doesn't accept that kind of object. That is a big way to mess up PowerShell. All right. Okay, so now one more thing to talk about here with remoting is, can you make a remoting session ahead of time and use it? And the answer is absolutely yes, you can. So it's a very handy trick to use, like in a script, for instance, if you want to contact a remote computer and you want to do a lot of things with it. So maybe you have 5 or 6 or 10 invoke command lines in your script, and each one doing something different. Well, remember, every time you use invoke command, it opens a PowerShell session, runs the code either in the script you're sending to it or the script block, one or the other, and then closes the remoting session. So if I do that like 10 times in a row, it can kind of add up, right? So if I do this, like I do this, start this now, start it again, that was 3 different times it opened a remoting session on client 2, ran the code that I'm sending over to it, and then closed that session when it was done. So it opened, ran, and closed, open, ran, and closed, open, ran, and closed. All right. So can I make it so the remoting session stays open? And the answer is absolutely yes, you can. So what you do is you create a session ahead of time and store it in a variable. So maybe $S for session here, I'll do new PS session, and the computer name will do client 2. All right. And so then when I do invoke command, instead of calling computer name, I can call that session, and then whatever script block I wanted to run. Right, so something like this. Right, so I can totally do that. Right, and if I do get PS session, you'll notice that that session is still kept open. Okay, so I could keep running commands through it over and over and over again. And it's still going through that same PowerShell session. And then when I'm done with it, I could take the session, the variable that represents the session, and do remove PS session. And that will then close it down. So if I go back to do get PS session, I don't have anything opened anymore. All right. Now, so using this could be neat to do when you're working a script, for instance. So if you need to contact a lot of remote computers, you could go make a script that has a for each construct in it. And then inside the for each loop, you do new PS session for each computer, run your invoke command lines in that, and then do remove PS session at the end of the iteration of for each. Okay, so I can loop through a lot of computer names, and for each one, I open a session, run the commands in it, and then close the session out. Okay, so that could be of use to me. Right. Now, one thing to note though, when it comes to sessions, and especially when you're using scripts, there are a few caveats that kind of go along with it that could seem frustrating at the time. And so one of those would be like variables. Okay, so not, like when I did my video on variables, arrays, and hash tables and stuff like that, I had mentioned that when you cast something into a variable, that variable lives in whatever PowerShell session you defined it in, right? So in this case, I had the PowerShell console open, and it's this PowerShell session. So if I take like $x equals 10, and I defined that, if I open up another PowerShell console, this is a different session. And if I ask it $x, it has no clue what I'm talking about. Likewise, if I were to do invoke invoke command, computer name client2, and then script block. Let's go ask it what $x is. It's like not going to know, right? Because when you do this, invoke command is opening a separate PowerShell session on a remote computer. And that PowerShell session has no clue what variables you have defined locally. Okay, so in order to send the results of a local variable over to a remote session, there is another variable you use here. And the name of it is actually using. So you do $using colon and then the name of your local variable. Okay, so in this case, I do $using colon X and notice, see how the remote session, how new $x was 10. Okay, so be aware of that. When you do invoke command or enter PS session or new PS session, the contents of your local variables are not magically going to be transported over to that remote session. So when you're running your code in the remote code, if you want it to pull a variable from the local session where the remoting is coming from, you can use $using colon and then the name of the local variable. Again, when we're talking variables, the $sign is not part of the name. Okay, so in this case it would be X would be the name of the variable, and like here I had $S, again S would be the name of the variable. All right, so just don't let that catch you up there. Another thing as well, by default, when you remote into another computer, that other computer cannot transmit your Kerberos token to another computer from there. Okay, so like if on client 2 I was running code that then connected to another computer, that would fail. Okay, so there are ways to deal with that. In remoting with invoke command, you can create a connection using cred SSP, CRED SSP. All right, and I'm not going to get into that here. If you look at the examples on invoke command, there is an example. I think it's like either example like 17 or 18 in the help for invoke command. There is an example that gets into how to use cred SSP. All right. So that can catch up if you're not aware. And then lastly here, um, what are the limits on this? So notice I'm connecting to client 2, and meanwhile, client 2, like is still logged in locally here. So normally, like if you take remote desktop, with remote desktop, only one login can happen on a client computer. So if I were to try to remote desktop into client 2, whoever was logged in locally would be tossed out. That's not the same with PowerShell remoting. So in PowerShell remoting, you can open up remote PowerShell sessions using remoting, and it does not impact the local user who might be logged into that desktop, to that client computer. Okay, so what's controlling that? Well, on a computer with remoting enabled, you do get a remoting drive. So if you do type in get PS drive, you can see what drives are available, and WSMan is one of those drives. And so if I connect into it, cd wsman colon, I can see that there's actually stuff in here. So let's change directory to localhost, do a dir on that, and if I look here, I can see that there's a few different folders here. They call them containers, but basically they're folders. So if I go into like the client folder and look, I can see that there's settings in here, right? If I back out of that and maybe go into service and dir, I can see there's settings in here. Now the one I want to pay attention to is this one right here, max connections. And so a client computer can actually take 300 connections, right, at a time. Okay, so it's definitely not limited to like, one or two or something like that. And you don't you don't affect the person who might be locally logged into the desktop of that computer. So if you're like, I don't know, in you're an IT admin and you wanted to do something on someone's Windows 10 computer and they're currently logged into that computer and working, you doing PowerShell remoting isn't going to affect them, uh, affect their login. Okay. Now, obviously, if you remote into their computer and then like shut it down, that would obviously affect them. But it's not going to log them off for you to be able to log in. All right. So it does allow quite a bit. You could actually adjust this value if you wanted to, up or down. If you wanted to allow less computers, allow more. Allow filters for who's allowed to remote desktop. You could do that. And then lastly here, if you look at what remoting sessions are available, get PS session configuration, you could see what remoting sessions are currently here, what endpoints are currently configured. And so this is the one that gets connected to by default, this Microsoft.PowerShell. So it has a name, and you can see it has a permission list for who's allowed to connect to it. Right? So so there are, if you did have PowerShell 7 installed in the computer, you could also enable remoting through it. And PowerShell 7 does have its own endpoints as well that have their name to them. So by default, when you remote to another computer, you get this PowerShell session right here, which is 5.1. If you wanted the PowerShell 7 one, you do have to call it out by name on what configuration you want to connect to. So I do have a previous video on how to do that. It applies for both Windows 10 and Windows 11. So if you want to see that, check that out. But with that, I will bring this video to a close here. Pretty much, the basics of PowerShell remoting. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to give me a shout. Likewise, if you like the content, please consider liking and subscribing. Subscribing is the big one here. So I need 1,000 subscribers before I can monetize my channel. So anyone who subscribes is definitely helping me out, and it does not cost you anything to subscribe. So I would greatly appreciate it. So with that, any comments, questions, future video topics you want to see, please drop me a comment, and we will see you in the next video.